Thanks, everybody, for coming tonight. It's always nicer to speak to a full room than an empty one, so I'm really gratified and pleased that you've all come. There are probably some of you here in this room that know more about Banksy than I do. I'm going to start with that disclaimer. But I do hope to share some information tonight that maybe you don't already know, and my real goal is to try to place Banksy within the context of the overall world of the visual arts. Who is he? What does he do? Why does it matter? How is he like or different to Michelangelo or Picasso or whatever? So I'm going to try to establish some context and hopefully provide some information that you haven't come across before. In 1967 in Philadelphia, a 14-year-old kid named Darryl McCrae, aka Cornbread, made an effort to impress a girl named Cynthia by writing "Cornbread loves Cynthia" in spray paint all over walls throughout the north side of the city. Cornbread was not the first teenager to spray paint his city's walls. As far back as the 1930s, gang members in Los Angeles and other cities were using signatures and visual motifs to demarcate their territories. Other forms of graffiti have been in evidence for over 15,000 years, since Stone Age artists created the fabulous walls in the caves at Lascaux. Many of you will be familiar with this iconic image from the period around the Second World War. The love-struck Cornbread had invented an activity known as tagging, a basic form of graffiti in which the writer signs his highly stylized name or signature using spray paint. What Cornbread was doing was not entirely unique. However, what was unique was the fact that Cornbread's graffiti, and I quote, almost single-handedly took the idea of tagging away from gangs and transformed it into an attention grabber available to everyone. At the height of his fame in the 1960s and 70s, no target was safe from Cornbread's tag, not even an elephant at the Philadelphia Zoo or the Jackson 5's private 747. From that point on, the writing of one's name, or more often nickname, in a stylized fashion on as many surfaces as possible became a way for young, typically disadvantaged young people to express themselves to a large audience. A way for them to shout, "I am here and I can do something that you can't," to a society that otherwise ignored their very existence. The creation of graffiti has always been a criminal act and has always involved any number of criminal enterprises in its execution. The theft of the spray paint, the trespassing to access a suitable canvas, the defacing of public or sometimes private property. And as an aside, it's interesting to note that the very language created by the early graffiti artists to talk about their enterprise was couched in the artistic. When a graffiti artist stole cans of spray paint, he was said to have invented his paint. The public response to graffiti, both official and unofficial, has always been largely negative. Graffiti writers have typically been seen as vandals and their activities destructive and antisocial. Authorities have viewed graffiti as primarily a criminal enterprise to be squashed, and huge sums of public funds have been dedicated to thwarting the graffiti artist and erasing the products of his efforts. The reaction is based on the assumption that the impetus that drives the graffiti writer is a destructive one. However, as Norman Mailer puts it in his 1974 essay, The Faith of Graffiti, and I quote, "In the ghetto, it is almost impossible to find some quiet location for our identity. No, in the environment of the slum, the courage to display yourself is your only capital, and crime is the productive process which converts such capital to the modern powers of the world, ego, and money," end quote. In other words, in the mind of the graffiti writer, the creating of graffiti provides the perpetrator with the only avenue available to elevate himself above the downtrodden station which has characterized his life and to endow him with some status. In addition, the aesthetic of the graffiti artist is such that he sees his work and that of his contemporaries not as the defacement of a pristine landscape, but the enhancement of it. To the graffiti artist, a wall with graffiti is much more beautiful than one without it. For the graffiti artist, it's the failure of the general public to be able to distinguish between the scribblings on a men's room wall and the artistry of a well-executed throw-up or piece. Throw-up and piece being terms to refer to a more elaborate piece of graffiti in which the tag is embellished with multiple colors, fantastical design elements, cartoon characters, and other visual effects, such as those depicted here. In addition to the satisfaction of having one's existence validated through the very public presence of one's graffiti, graffiti artists almost universally admit that the thrill of the act of creation, of gaining access to forbidden, hard-to-reach, and sometimes downright dangerous sites, of evading the guardians of those sites for sometimes hours that it takes to create a piece, and of escaping unmolested, provides another impetus for this activity. Graffiti artists tend to see themselves as outlaws, defying convention and regulation, working outside the boundaries of acceptable society, and harboring a worldview that challenges the mainstream. These characteristics are embodied in the messages of many of the street artists who have gained notoriety over the past couple of decades, including the artist known as Banksy. But graffiti was primarily intended for an audience of peers. Graffiti artists cared little about what people like you or me thought of their work. What did matter to the original graffiti artists was what other graffiti artists and the other members of their immediate social groups thought of their creations, and the only criticism that garnered any attention from them was that rendered by other graffiti artists. Along the way, a couple of things happened. Graffiti began to be appreciated by art collectors and the owners of art galleries, and the nature of graffiti began to change from spray-painted taggings and pieces to a wider range of media forms. As the variety of art forms grew, the term graffiti began to have less currency, and the broader term street art came into use. The term street art has come to refer to any art developed in public spaces, that is, in the streets, though the term usually refers to art of an illicit nature, as opposed to, for instance, government or community-funded art initiatives. The term can include traditional graffiti artwork, though it is often used to distinguish modern public space artwork from traditional graffiti and the overtones of gang territoriality and vandalism associated with it. In addition to graffiti, street art can include such media as stenciling, like this, wheat pasting, the use of homemade wallpaper paste to affix a pre-printed image onto a flat surface, and sticker art, the application of pre-printed adhesive-backed stickers posted in a quick and dirty style called slap tagging. The unauthorized installation of sculptural objects and the physical alterations of elements of the cityscape, such as street signs, traditional public sculptures, bike racks, fire hydrants, sidewalk grates, etc., are also included under the rubric of street art. You may recognize this image as the Charging Bull sculpture by artist Arturo de Modica, also known as the Wall Street Bull, which a group of street artists surreptitiously covered with knitting in a process known as yarn bombing. With the evolution of graffiti into street art, the impetus driving the artists has changed dramatically. While many street artists began as graffiti writers, these artists are patently producing works intended for consumption by the public at large, as opposed to an insular set of their cronies. Their work, though sometimes cryptic and esoteric, typically carries messages that embody opinions on an array of public or societal issues. The message of street art is almost universally anti-establishment and revolutionary to one degree or another. Indeed, the very act of creating street art is a poke in the eye to private, municipal, or sometimes international stewards of the properties on which the artwork is created. So where does the artist known as Banksy fit into this world of street art? For that matter, where does street art fit into the larger world of the visual arts? Banksy is almost certainly the preeminent figure in the world of street art and has been for over a decade. It is his name that is most widely associated with the movement and his work that commands the highest prices at the galleries and auction houses where artistic reputations are established. In 2010, Time magazine selected him for its list of the world's 100 most influential people, along with such luminaries as Barack Obama, Steve Jobs, and Lady Gaga. But Banksy can also be seen as a successor to a list of artists who have made their names by creating and exhibiting works that fall outside the grand tradition of the visual arts established by Michelangelo, Rembrandt, Monet, Van Gogh, Picasso, and the others. Since the early 20th century, artists have been exhibiting works valued not so much because of the artistic elements embodied in the works themselves, elements such as color, line, perspective, shape, texture, and so forth, but rather because of the relationship of the artwork to society. In 1917, Marcel Duchamp mounted a common urinal on a pedestal, titled it Fountain, and attempted to exhibit it in a show at the Society of Independent Artists. Such ready-mades became a staple of art exhibitions for years after that, raising the question, among others I might add, of whether the quality of the art object itself was truly at the heart of its value. Certainly few would argue that the technical excellence of today's street artists, as attractive, engaging, and well-produced as their work might be, approaches that of works like Starry Night, the Mona Lisa, or Water Lilies. While street artists such as Banksy seem to possess an absolute commitment to the value of the opinions and ideas they express through their works, they have also made it a tenet of their movement to question the monetary and even artistic value of the works they themselves produce. This piece by Banksy pokes fun at art collectors and consumers who are willing to spend 6- and 7-figure amounts on street art or the works of other contemporary artists. I hope you can read what the sign says up there. And Banksy isn't the first artist to challenge the aesthetics of the art world by questioning the value or quality of their very own highly regarded works. In 1961, in an effort to question the tacit assertion that any item touched by an artist deserves to be considered art, Italian artist Piero Manzoni produced a large number of tin cans labeled Merda d'Artista, purported to contain examples of the artist's own fecal output. The art-producing public responded to Manzoni's challenge in resounding fashion. In 2008, one of Manzoni's cans of Merda d'Artista sold at Sotheby's for $166,618. The most recent and high-profile example of this guerrilla approach to expressing disdain for the critics, dealers, gallery owners, and museum curators who support and nurture the work of contemporary artists occurred at Sotheby's auction house on October 5th of last year. The last lot of the day's auction was a copy of Banksy's Girl with Balloon, a 2006 spray paint on canvas that, by the way, was voted Britain's favorite artwork in a poll conducted in 2017. As the gavel fell on a selling price of $1.4 million, a record high for a Banksy work, the painting suddenly began to slide down the frame and was shredded by a mechanism installed in the bottom of the frame, apparently triggered by a remote-controlled device somewhere in the room. At the moment of the shredding, an image of the auction room was also posted on Banksy's Instagram account. The accompanying caption, "Going, going, gone," is a pun on the typical words spoken by an auctioneer. After half of the painting had been shredded, it stopped, and gallery staff rushed to remove the piece from the wall and hustle it off to storage. We know that Banksy was behind the stunt because of a video posted by Banksy to his Instagram account showing a hooded figure fitting a shredder into the frame of a painting, with a text appearing on the screen reading, "In case it was ever put up for auction." The question that remains is, who else was in on the act? Did Sotheby's collude with the artist in an effort to create publicity and, perhaps, further increase public interest in and the potential value of future art sales? Opinion is divided. Those who believe the auction house had prior knowledge of the planned stunt point to a number of anomalies in the piece itself and the way it was offered for sale. For example, the location of the painting in the room was way out of the way, not in a prominent location where it could be easily viewed by bidders. The piece was scheduled as the last lot of the auction for that day. The frame was unusually thick, a feature which Sotheby's curators would normally have questioned and investigated, but did not in this instance. The video of the installation of the battery-operated shredder was purportedly shot in 2006, and it's likely that the batteries would have to have been replaced between that time and the time of the auction. And finally, the back of the piece was inscribed, "Thanks," signed Joe with a heart, and Banksy's PR representative is a woman named Jo Banks. Sotheby's vehemently denies involvement in the stunt, as does a spokesperson on behalf of Banksy. However, regardless of who orchestrated the shredding, consensus is that the event has had a salutary effect on the value of a Banksy. Not surprisingly, the original purchaser, even though the painting was shredded, has decided to keep the piece, which has now been authenticated by Pest Control and named Love is in the Bin. Pest Control, by the way, is a group of people that Banksy has set up to authenticate and give names to the pieces of his work that he wants people to know are his. According to Acorus Andipa, an art dealer specializing in Banksy, the shredded piece is now probably worth more than $2 million. And Offer Waterman, a dealer in 20th century British art, states, and I quote, "The event is likely to make all of Banksy's artwork more valuable in the future." Interestingly enough, these pronouncements would seem to undermine Banksy's posture as ironic and anti-establishment. While street artists ridicule the art establishment and position themselves as rebels and renegades, most of them, Banksy included, have capitalized, sometimes against their will, on the interest shown in their work by gallery owners and art collectors. One of the most high-profile examples of how street artists have entered the mainstream is a work by a young California stencilist named Shepard Fairey, who created the iconic Hope image used by the Obama campaign during the 2008 presidential campaign. This phenomenon is suggestive of the tremendous power that the world of commercial art and advertising has to co-opt even the most uncooperative street artist and drag him kicking and screaming into the mainstream. Two other well-known artists must be mentioned, however briefly, in any consideration of street art as a significant subgenre of contemporary visual art. The first is Jean-Michel Basquiat, the Haitian-born artist who began spray painting graffiti on buildings in Lower Manhattan in 1976 at the age of 16. Like many street artists, Basquiat's images embodied commentary on such social themes as racism, colonialism, and class struggle. As he achieved significant success at an early age and very quickly made the move from the street to the gallery, enjoying lucrative partnerships with such famous gallery owners as Larry Gagosian, Bruno Bischofsberger, Anina Nosé, and Mary Boone, and a series of moderately successful collaborations with Andy Warhol. Like many street artists, Basquiat moved fluidly between the seedy milieu of the streets and the rarefied world of international art investors. The dual identity was symbolized by the artist's inclination to dress in expensive Armani suits, which he regularly wore to paint in, and which he often sported in public, spattered with the colors of his most recent creation. After a short but highly successful career, Basquiat died of a drug overdose in 1988 at age 27. Keith Haring, too, began his career on the streets of New York, or more accurately, in the subways, where in the late 1970s he began painting images in his highly recognizable style, an activity which got him arrested on a number of occasions. Haring's work depicted a wide range of highly political themes involving concepts of birth, death, sexuality, and war. He was known for taking on subjects like apartheid, the crack cocaine epidemic, and AIDS awareness. Haring's career was marked by high-profile collaborations with artists and performers like Andy Warhol, Grace Jones, Madonna, and the aforementioned Jean-Michel Basquiat. And Haring enjoyed significant commercial success through the creation of pop art pieces influenced by popular products such as Coca-Cola, Lucky Strike cigarettes, and Absolute vodka. Apropos of his beginnings as a street artist, he considered it part of his mission to break down the barriers between high and low art. Like Basquiat, Herring too died young at age 31 from complications of AIDS. Furthermore, such artists as Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg, Roy Lichtenstein, and Andy Warhol all employed representations of common objects, mass media, and comic book images and consumer items in their work. It's evident then that Banksy and other street artists are working within a well-established tradition in which the ordinary or the mundane is elevated to the level of high art. In the case of the contemporary street artist, this tradition is one in which the artists frequently make self-deprecating and ironic comments about their own work and the work of other contemporary artists. At the same time, the themes of contemporary street art speak to some of the most vexing and timely issues facing us today. Some of these topics will be illustrated as we consider individual works by Banksy in the discussion which follows. At the thematic core of Banksy's work is a contempt for authority in almost any form, a posture often found among graffitists and street artists. With Banksy, however, this contempt is balanced out by a self-effacing willingness to mock the value and the importance of his own work. Given these facets of the artist's personality, it's perhaps appropriate that since early in his career, the image that Banksy has chosen as the main icon for his work is the rat. French stencilist Javier Prou, also known as Blek le Rat, has been cited by Banksy as his mentor and a major inspiration, and there is a clear similarity between the two artists' styles. Says Banksy, and I quote, "Every time I think I've painted something slightly original, I find out that Blek le Rat has done it as well only 20 years earlier." Blek le Rat began employing the rat image in the 1970s, stating, quote, "I began to spray some small rats in the streets of Paris because rats are the only wild animals living in cities, and only rats will survive when the human race disappears and dies out." The appropriateness of this image as a representative for a street artist seems obvious, since the rat, quote, "only comes out at night, is cunning and sneaky, and usually ends up causing some sort of damage to people's property," end of quote. Banksy himself has spoken directly of his choice of the rat as his most iconic image. He says, "If you feel dirty, insignificant, or unloved, then rats are a good role model. They exist without permission, they have no respect for the hierarchy of society, and they have sex 50 times a day." At one point, someone pointed out to Banksy that rat is an anagram of art. In typical self-mocking style, Banksy explains, "I'd been painting rats for 3 years before someone said, 'That's clever, it's an anagram of art.' And I had to pretend I'd known that all along." Beyond the ubiquitous rat stencils mentioned above, Banksy has produced a broad corpus of works that comment on a variety of social topics. One of the artist's greatest antagonisms is the extent to which the authorities in the United Kingdom have begun to employ closed-circuit television cameras, collectively referred to as CCTV, to keep an eye on the general populace. This work, titled "One Nation Under CCTV," produced in London in 2008, features a depiction of a child-sized artist rolling the letters on the wall under the scrutiny of a watchful security guard who is filming the act. Perhaps the most amazing thing about this work is that Banksy had to scale the wall and erect scaffolding in order to paint the piece, which is located right next to a bank of CCTV cameras that failed to capture the artist in the act. Banksy's output is prodigious. He has been responsible for the creation of not only thousands of stenciled images placed on surfaces on at least 4 continents, but countless other gallery prints, sculptures, exhibitions, happenings, installations, album covers, and one Academy Award nominated documentary film. The bulk of his output has occurred since October 16 years ago, when he strolled, disguised in an overcoat, scarf, and floppy hat, into the Tate Museum in London. and surreptitiously affixed to the wall of gallery number 7 a modified, unsigned oil painting which he had found in a London street market and which he titled, "Crime Watch UK has ruined the countryside for all of us." The work, which remained on the gallery wall for several hours, viewed by dozens of unquestioning museum goers before being removed, was accompanied by a homemade explanatory placard which provided the name of the piece, the medium, and an explanatory statement which read, and I quote, "It can be argued that defacing such an idyllic scene reflects the way that our nation has been vandalized by its obsession with crime and pedophilia, where any visit to a secluded beauty spot now feels like it may result in being molested or finding discarded body parts." End of quote. This act was actually videotaped and photographed by one of Banksy's partners in crime and posted to the internet, where it became widely disseminated, significantly broadening the public's awareness of the artist and enhancing his reputation as an audacious trickster. In 2008, he pulled a similar stunt at the British Museum, where he placed on exhibition a simulated primitive rock painting depicting a hunter pushing a shopping cart. This piece was in place for days before being discovered. In this instance, though, because of the increase in Banksy's notoriety over the intervening 5 years since the Tate prank, the museum chose to accession the piece into its permanent collection rather than discard it. Banksy has also pulled off similar stunts in New York at the Museum of Modern Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Brooklyn Museum, and the Museum of Natural History. In 2009, Banksy returned to the museum world for one of the largest exhibitions he's ever produced. Desiring to generate some publicity for the Bristol Museum and Art Gallery, the main art space in Banksy's native city, the artist's representatives approached the museum staff with a proposal to allow him and his team to convert the entire museum into a unique art installation featuring Banksy's style of humorous, ironic, sometimes whimsical street art alongside the museum's permanent collection. With perhaps some trepidation, the museum acceded to the idea, and overnight, the museum was transformed into a menagerie of unnatural history. Frozen fish sticks swimming in a fishbowl, a stately blood-spattered lion standing over the costume of its former trainer, modified paintings placed in among the museum's collection of old masters, and in the main entrance hall, a burnout ice cream truck that pumped out an eerie soundtrack of warped tunes while a giant ice cream cone melted on its roof. All in all, the exhibition featured over 100 works by the artist, most of which had never been displayed before. Banksy touted the exhibition as, quote, "the first show he had ever done where taxpayers' money is being used to hang up my pictures rather than scrape them off." In fact, however, this exhibition was paid for almost entirely by Banksy, who saw it as his gift to the city that had nurtured him. Over the course of the 4-week run, the exhibition had 111,285 visitors, nearly 6 times the number of visitors to the museum during that period the previous year. Some patrons waited in line for 7 hours to gain entrance to the show. Banksy's parting gift, the only piece from the exhibition that was not uninstalled at the conclusion of the exhibition, is the angel bust, which remains on display as part of the permanent collection. In 2006, Banksy invaded Los Angeles with his first large-scale exhibition in the United States, titled Barely Legal. The show featured the usual collection of jokey, provocative, tongue-in-cheek social commentary. A stark image of a television camera crew filming a child among the ruins as the producer holds back aid workers to allow for just one more shot. A panel van with a notice on the back reading, "How's my bombing?" instead of "How's my driving?" with an 800 number that links to a Navy recruiting office in Phoenix. And the usual modified old masters' works. But the centerpiece of this exhibition was a live elephant, painted red and festooned with gold fleurs-de-lis to match the room's brocade wallpaper. Banksy's rather heavy-handed reference to the elephant in the room, the nature of which Banksy elucidated in a handout which read, and I quote, 1.7 billion people have no access to clean drinking water. 20 billion people live below the poverty line. Every day, hundreds of people are made to feel physically sick by morons at art shows telling them how bad the world is, but never actually doing something about it. Anybody want a free glass of wine? The show ran for only 3 days, but was visited by an estimated 30,000 people, including Brad Pitt, Angelina Jolie, and Jude Law, all of whom who purchased art. It's estimated that Banksy cleared some £3 million in total sales from this exhibition. Perhaps Banksy's most audacious work to date was done in the Palestinian territories, where in 2005 he took the highly controversial 425-mile-long West Bank barrier wall as his canvas. In Banksy's opinion, the wall essentially turns Palestine into the world's largest open prison. During his visit there, Banksy created 9 images along the barrier while braving the hostile attention of the Israeli security forces patrolling the wall, who occasionally fired shots over the artist's head and pointed guns in his direction. Much of the art he produced on the wall visually subverts and draws attention to its nature as a barrier by incorporating images of escape. A girl being carried away by a bunch of balloons, a little boy painting a rope ladder. Other pieces reveal a virtual reality that underlines the negation of humanity that the barrier represents. Children in areas cut off from any access to the sea, playing with sand buckets and spades on piles of rubble that look like sand. And corners of the wall being peeled back to reveal imagined lush landscapes behind. Among the thousands of stenciled images that Banksy has produced, these 9 works are certainly among his most political and controversial. Yet even these maintain an element of the whimsical that characterizes much of his work. So who is Banksy? Outside of a surprisingly large but exceedingly tight-lipped cadre of friends, supporters, dealers, collaborators, and fellow artists, no one knows for absolute sure. There are those who claim to have figured out the artist's true identity using sophisticated forensics technique. More about that later. But to date, no definitive identity has been established, and Banksy himself certainly has not stepped forward to say, yes, that's me. And this is one of the most interesting things about Banksy, the degree of success he has had at maintaining his anonymity. Given the fact that since at least 2003, the artist has been engaging in thousands of creative acts in public spaces in numerous countries, has mounted dozens of free public exhibitions, installations, and events, has produced nearly a dozen publications and 1 Academy Award-nominated film, it's hard to imagine how he has not been outed by one of the hundreds of individuals with whom he has collaborated over his career. One story may serve to illustrate the high degree of loyalty afforded to Banksy. For about a decade during his early career, Banksy maintained a relationship with an art dealer named Steve Lazaridis, who originally sold Banksy prints out of his car, but later established a very successful gallery that succeeded largely due to Lazaridis' access to Banksy and his ever-increasingly popular works. For the period of their relationship, Lazaridis served as Banksy's agent, manager, salesman, partner in crime, and probably best friend. And because of Lazaridis' acumen as a purveyor of the Banksy brand, it is safe to say that without Lazaridis, Banksy would simply not have the recognition, the influence, and the money that he has today. However, around the end of 2007, the relationship fell apart, and the two men no longer speak to one another. Although neither has commented extensively on the breakup, Banksy made it a point to include a caption beneath Lazaridis' image in the Banksy film Exit Through the Gift Shop that identifies Lazaridis simply as Banksy's former spokesman. Such an insulting reference might have prompted some to take revenge on the man who gave such clearly intended disrespect. But all these years later, Lazaridis maintains, as do all of Banksy's other collaborators, complete silence on the artist's true identity. Indeed, few of Banksy's more notable accomplishments would have been possible without collaboration with many, many other individuals. And it's his ability to engender loyalty among his colleagues that may stand as Banksy's most notable attribute and the one that has had the greatest impact on his success. Banksy's tenacity in maintaining his anonymity can be attributed to at least two factors. First, there's the illegal nature of much of what Banksy does. As the artist puts it, authenticating one of his pieces of street art as a known individual would be like entering a signed confession to a crime. In large measure, Banksy has managed to stay out of trouble. It appears he was arrested once in New York for painting a picture about corruption on a billboard. As a result, says Banksy, I spent 40 hours in a cell with the cops taking the piss and telling me lies, followed by a spell of community service and a hefty fine. One can understand why he would wish to avoid a repeat of such an experience. However, more cynical observers cite a second reason for Banksy's tenacious secrecy. As his good friend and fellow street artist Shepard Fairey puts it, quote, Banksy cares very much about selling art and what people think of him, and he understands thoroughly that people's fantasy is a far better marketing tool than reality. Or as Banksy himself puts it, I don't know why people are so keen to put the details of their private life in public. They forget that invisibility is a superpower. What few facts we do know about Banksy are these. He was born in Bristol, England, in or sometime around 1974. He began his career as a graffiti artist in the early 1990s as part of a graffiti gang known as the Dry Breads Crew. Beginning as a freehand artist, Banksy tells this story by way of explaining why he turned to stenciling as his primary form. At age 18, he was in the middle of painting a train with a gang of his friends when the British Transport Police showed up. Everybody ran, but Banksy got ripped to shreds by thorny bushes as he tried to make his escape. Says Banksy, the rest of my mates made it to the car and disappeared, so I spent over an hour hidden under a dumper truck with engine oil leaking all over me. As I lay there listening to the cops on the tracks, I realized I had to cut my painting time in half or give up altogether. I was staring straight up at the stenciled plate on the bottom of a fuel tank when I realized I could just copy that style and make each letter 3 feet high. Besides, he continues candidly, I was 21 and crap. I wasn't good at freehand graffiti. I was too slow. Whatever the reason, from that time on, Banksy has largely employed the stenciling technique in his two-dimensional works, which, for his more involved pieces, may require hours or even days meticulously cutting out multiple stencils from stiff cardboard, but only minutes or seconds of on-site time laying down the paint. Banksy's adopted name may or not give clues to his true identity. There are rumors that early in his graffiti career, the artist occasionally signed his pieces with the name Robin Banks, a clear attempt at establishing an outlaw persona. And there are those who insist that Robin is the artist's true first name. However, at this moment in time, such speculation remains just that. Banksy has long enjoyed relationships, often cordial, sometimes antagonistic, with other street artists. He has also assembled around him a team, originally referred to as Team Banksy, and now collectively known as Pest Control, which serves as a buffer from the public and as an enabling team who help with the planning and execution of many of the artist's more ambitious projects. Pest Control has served as the authenticating entity for Banksy's work. Banksy's street pieces are not often signed, although some of his stencils are adorned with the standard Banksy logo. Nevertheless, because a stenciled signature is so easy to replicate and fake, no work attributed to Banksy can be considered genuine unless it's accompanied by a certificate of authenticity from Pest Control. These certificates take an interesting form. Years ago, Banksy produced a run of 10,000 counterfeit 10 British pound notes on which he replaced the face of the Queen with the face of Princess Diana. Banksy reportedly had initially planned a helicopter drop of these notes, then reconsidered when he came to the realization that such an act involved the mass distribution of counterfeit currency, an act that even for Banksy might stretch the limits of good sense from a liability standpoint. So with a closet full of bogus currency, Banksy struck upon the idea of using these notes as seals of authenticity. Consequently, when pest control positively identifies a Banksy work as authentic, they often issue a certificate adorned one half of what they call a die-faced tenor. In March 4th, 2016 online issue of the Evening Standard, a story appears that details the claim by a group of researchers at Queen Mary University of London that they have established Banksy's true identity through the use of a mathematical technique known as geographic profiling. Using that technique, researchers looked at the location of 140 Banksy artworks in London and Bristol and publicly available information about dresses for the men they most believed to be the artist. Supposedly, the technique takes as input the locations of these artworks and calculates the probability of the artist's residence across that study area. By matching the location of the residences of 10 individuals suspected of being Banksy with the location of the artworks, the researchers have arrived at what they say is a very high level of confidence at the conclusion that Banksy is in fact a Bristol resident named Robin Gunningham, a name identified in a 2008 newspaper investigation. However, because this analysis rests on the assumption that the 140 artworks inputted into the database are indeed Banksy's work, and because, as has been noted earlier, a street artist's work is notoriously subject to forgery, it's hard to take that conclusion of the study as definitive. Finally, in an article in the May 14th, 2007 issue of The New Yorker, Banksy responds to the question, "Why do you do what you do?" with a wry quote, and I quote, "I originally set out to try and save the world, but now I'm not sure I like it enough." End of quote. For an artist who has focused the past 20 years on the human failings which have created the problems faced by mankind in the 21st century, the world must indeed look like a hostile environment. Yet, in a seemingly never-ending output of stenciled images on walls all over the world, images combining a unique mix of social consciousness, whimsy, anti-authoritarianism, and humor, both light and dark, the artist known as Banksy continues to promote an implicit belief that in recognizing the problems we all face and in drawing attention to those issues, we may someday find a way to effectively address them and make the world a more likable and livable place for all of the world's people. And besides, despite what he may say to an interviewer, I believe that Banksy is still having a lot of fun. Thank you very much. Yeah, if you look at the literature, I don't know if they're ignored, but they don't receive the coverage that the men do. And I wonder how much that has to do with the sheer volume of the number of male graffiti artists. The piece that you saw, the Wall Street Bull piece, was a piece done by female artists, which also sort of sets up that stereotype that what women do is knit, but that's kind of beside the point. But your point's well taken. Yeah, they are not as well represented as men are, for sure. You know what? I mean, who knows? He's been doing this stuff for a long time, and as careful as he may have been, he's probably left a pretty long and extensive trail of breadcrumbs that I can't imagine a good private detective couldn't pick up on and track this guy down if they wanted to badly enough. Some recent new evidence has come to light as to his identity. In the video that was taken of the shredding event, there is a shot of a man taking a picture of what's happening who looks very much like a picture of this man, Robin Gunnison, that was taken 20 or 25 years ago. There's also a piece of Banksy work that was done 15 or 20 years ago that's purported to be a self-portrait that also looks like Robin Gunningham. So Art News Online late last year published an article that said, here are the 10 people most likely to be Banksy, and here are the percentages of likelihood that each one is. And they calculated the percentage that he's Robin Gunningham at about 75%. But until he steps forward and says, yeah, that's me, nobody's going to know absolutely for sure. But, you know, I don't think it's going to be that much longer before this guy gets nailed, because he's just been out there too long. And you know, with all the investigative techniques that are available, I mean, you know, it can't be that difficult to find out where Robin Gunningham lives, stake out his house, and find out where he goes every day. So it's going to happen sooner or later. Yeah. I think there's a very good chance it will. I think the value of his work is so closely tied to his character and his persona, and the way he's been able to set himself up as something entirely unique in the art world. Once that bubble is burst, it seems to me that the value of his pieces is going to deflate pretty rapidly. Other questions, comments? If not, thank you very much for your attention. I enjoyed having you here tonight. It was fun. Thank you.